Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be trash talking. We're going to be talking about the complex landscape of household food waste. And I'm talking to Claire Kneller, who is the Managing Director of WRAP Asia Pacific. Hi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So I'll get you to introduce yourself in a bit more detail, but I'd also love to know what WRAP means.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So WRAP stands for the Waste and Resources Action Programme, which doesn't really give so much more information, but WRAP is a charity and a not-for-profit. We're headquartered in the UK. I head up our Asia Pacific office, and we are all about the circular economy. So creating that shift from the very linear economy that we have now, where we take stuff, we make it into something, and then we throw it away at the end of its life. It's really about shifting towards that more circular economy. And we do that for kind of stuff. So really we focus in three key areas. So food, how do we create a more circular food system? Plastics, big issue, and clothing and textiles. So we thought, why do one really hard thing when you can do three all at the same time?
I mean, I guess that in some ways there's some similarities or overlapping things. Like I assume plastics would actually go into food waste and also into clothing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the nexus of food and packaging particularly is a really interesting one, and you start to play in both of those spaces. So how do you use packaging really effectively to protect your food? It does a really good job of stopping food from being damaged or being contaminated. But how do you make sure it's the right kind of packaging? It's not too much. You're not over packaging things. Similarly, plastics and clothing is a really interesting one. About 60% of the clothing that is imported into Australia is made essentially of plastic. It's made of fossil-based fibers. So yeah, that's something that kind of hasn't really hit the mainstream yet, but is a really critical part of how you create a circular economy for clothing, particularly.
Yeah. And other than WRAP, is there anything else you'd like to let us know about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually kind of wear two hats. So WRAP does a lot of work on food, and we work globally. Here in Australia, we partner with a really incredible organization called End Food Waste Australia, which does exactly what the name suggests. End Food Waste is the leading organization in Australia that's tasked with delivering Australia's national food waste target. So we have a target here in Australia to halve food loss and waste by 2030. It's a massive ask. And End Food Waste really leads on that charge. And with my WRAP hat on, we partner to really have two incredible NGOs working on that work. Really building on the local knowledge and, contextual piece and the technical knowledge that End Food Waste brings, and WRAP's kind of global advocacy work and some of the work that we've done in the UK that's really been leading the charge globally on food waste.
Great. And I'm very much looking forward to learning more about how we can end food waste and how, we can help to hit those targets.
It's doable. It's definitely doable. There's actually a really interesting piece of work, a feasibility study that got published in 2021 that basically said is this possible? Can we halve food waste by 2030? The answer to that is yes, but it requires unprecedented action across the whole kind of remit. So from government, from businesses, from individuals. So all of the solutions are there. It's really about implementation. This is not a big problem where we're like, oh, we don't know how to fix this problem. It's a problem where we're like, we have the solutions. How do we get them implemented at scale?
Okay. And it'll just be a matter of actually doing it. So
yeah, essentially. Yeah. Which is not to say that there isn't space for innovation and new research in this area. Of course there is. But it's really to say that if you look at the good practice from around the world, much of which has been generated here in Australia, we have the technology and the solutions to be able to say, actually, we can be looking at where all this food is being wasted across the whole supply chain. So it's everywhere. It's from the farm all the way through to the fork. And we can say, we can identify the root causes of these, and then we can apply these different solutions to them. And some of them are very specific and some of them are very systemic. So this whole challenge of food loss and waste is a real systemic problem. That means you have to look at the whole supply chain when you're talking about how to address it. And household food waste is a really good example of that. So some of the food that's wasted in our homes is down to us. And then some of it is due to stuff that happens further down the supply chain. A really good example of that in Australia is use by dates and best before dates. There's almost no consistency about how they're used. So which kind of product has what kind of date on. And it makes it really hard for people to understand. So a use by date is about a food safety issue. So you shouldn't eat food after the use by date. A best before date is about food quality, and it's perfectly safe to eat something after the best before date. But in the retail environment here in Australia, you might go into a supermarket and you might see 3 items from the same product line. So 3 kinds of cheese, for example. One will have a use by date, one will have a best before date, one might have both. And it makes it really confusing for people to try and do the right thing at home if they're not given the right tools to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the supply chain and how we can, improve our own food waste. But before we do that, we're going to do a section called Have You Met Claire, where we get to know you through some of your favorite things. And the first thing I'd like to know is, what is your favorite book?
Oh my God. There's absolutely no way I can pick a favorite book. I am an avid reader. I read so much. It's just impossible. What I do love is a few years ago, I made a New Year's resolution to only read women authors for a year. It's the only New Year's resolution I've ever kept. And I loved it. So I've basically kind of carried on doing that since then. So I read nearly all female authors. And this year, my goal is to kind of really expand the number of non-white, non-British, not American writers that I'm reading. So yeah, I would love any recommendations that you or your listeners would like to send me.
Oh man, I have so many recommendations. I had a colleague who asked for some book recommendations, and I sent a list, and I afterwards realized they were all women, completely coincidentally. And quite a number of them were women of color, but I can't remember that list, so I'll have to go back and look for it, and then I'll send it to you.
Please do.
And maybe you can share some of the books that maybe are standouts for you.
Oh, absolutely. I actually last year tracked every book that I read. I've got a little Google spreadsheet with some analysis of it. I read some really fantastic Australian authors last year that I enjoyed a lot. Some standouts. Actually, the author that I really loved last year is Maggie O'Farrell. So she wrote Hamnet, which is one of her best-selling books, and her most recent book is called The Marriage Plot, which set in like 16th century Italy. And yeah, it's amazing. I highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to pop that onto my list.
You should.
Thank you. And have you enjoyed any movies recently?
I have just like the most terrible taste in films. My absolute pinnacle is like a really cheesy rom-com. I've watched like The Holiday about 17 times. I love it. It's like a Christmas classic for me. So yeah, my partner just hates going to the cinema with me and hates watching films with me because he thinks films are for education and I think they're for entertainment.
I think films can be for both.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think it's very valid to want to have entertainment and to, you know, switch off sometimes.
Oh, completely. And I think just watching films where nice things happen to women is actually really great, as opposed to films where terrible things happen to women.
Yeah, that's very true. I think, yeah, many films just, it's, you know, the man is okay. He gets the thing, whatever that happens at the end is always good for him, but not always for the women.
Exactly. It's like, how long into this film is a woman going to be murdered for the plot?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And do you listen to any podcasts?
I do listen to a couple of podcasts, and they're kind of mostly comedy ones. So there's the one called Shagged, Married, Annoyed, which is a British couple who I started listening to before I moved out here. And they're a married couple, and they just do this podcast in their home. They talk about their kids. They talk about like random stuff they've been doing. They answer questions from the public, and it's really random, and it's very hard to describe it in a way that makes it sound good, but it is absolutely hilarious. They're like incredibly popular and successful. They've done 2 like stadium tours with their podcast. But yeah, I highly recommend that for anyone who has a British sense of humor or would like to like get into the British sense of humor. But they're pretty funny.
All right. Thank you. I think sometimes, you know, you can just see some people have that je ne sais quoi essence to them. And I guess they probably do if they can just talk about anything and people and you love them.
They really do. So he was a stand-up comedian before he started doing the podcast. And she has done like loads of different kind of entertainment type jobs. So they're just like this real kind of powerhouse entertainment couple, but they're so down to earth. Even though they've done these like huge stadium tours and done the podcast in front of like tens of thousands of people. So yeah, they're really kind of, you just feel like they're your friends. And they're just talking about all this kind of wild, crazy stuff and how random their kids are and pet peeves. Like they have a little beef section where they have a beef with each other. And yeah, it's really funny. I highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you. I thought the beef section was going to be they talk about beef they had that week or something, like a meal.
No, it's definitely the beef cut where you're like, this is what you did to annoy me this week.
Okay. And do you have a role model?
Do I have a role model? Oh my God. I don't think I have like one role model. I think I have people who have really influenced me throughout my life and throughout my career. I have an incredible kind of group of friends who just are so like impressive to me. Like they do all these amazing things. And one of my friends has twins and she's a teacher, and she's like, oh, well, I thought I wasn't really busy enough, so I'm going to start this like Etsy shop. So she just does all of that and like makes all of this stuff for that. And her house is so cool. And just like, I just have all these great friends who do all this amazing stuff. And I'm just like, how do you have time to do this? I come home from work and I literally just sit on the couch for like an hour staring into space.
Yeah, that sounds what I do when I get home. I'm like, I just need to sit down with a cup of tea and just do nothing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then that's my evening.
Yeah, maybe like an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine that I've seen 17 times already.
Mm-hmm. And have you completed any courses that have inspired you?
I haven't done like official kind of study for a long time, partly because actually just doing the job that I do and coming out to Australia, I moved out here from the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent, just means that I am learning on the job all the time. So previously with RAP in the UK, I worked mainly on our food program. Coming out here, I now cover like our whole remit of everything that we do. So I really had to learn quite quickly, like what we do on plastics, all the stuff that we do on textiles, like how those sectors work, who the key players are. So literally every day is a school day, which is fantastic. I love it so much. But I think the thing that kind of most changed me, the most recent thing that I've done is I actually did some leadership coaching with a coach back in the UK, a lady called Christine Champion, and she just like completely changed my outlook on my career and my professional life and pulled me out of kind of a bit of a funk where I was thinking, just, I'm not going anywhere. I'm kind of had taken a couple of sideways moves and everything just seemed really static. And she just, completely changed my outlook on my life and my career. So, I really rate her influence on me very highly.
Sometimes it just takes, one course or one person to really, I guess, influence your life. And as you were saying, change it and change your view, your perspective, and also your career path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And she really kind of got me to think about things in a different way. Like a really good example, we were talking about networking and I was like, I'm not really very good at networking. I don't really enjoy it. And actually what I don't really enjoy is going to a conference where there's like 500 people there that I don't know and like working the room. And some people absolutely love that. I'm not that person. And she was like, well, what else can you class as networking? And we had this whole conversation about all of these other activities that actually are networking, like doing this podcast, for example, is a kind of networking. And she was like, you don't like doing that one thing. Okay, go and do all of these other things instead that actually really speak to your kind of skills and capabilities and your preferences and make them work for you. And then if you do end up being in the conference room with 500 people, like here are some, tips that you can use to get the most out of that experience, even though it's not like your favorite thing to do. So she really helped me kind of put a different lens on, some of those different aspects of my working life that just really made a huge difference to me.
Sounds like she comes in with a really great perspective in, changing your perspective on how you look at certain things. I think that the idea of networking with 500 people in a conference terrifies me. So I really love just, saying here are some ways that you can fix it, but also there are other ways to network. You don't have to network in this one way. That's amazing.
Yeah, completely. And just, kind of not so much zooming out. I think it's kind of widening the perspective on what your professional life, what some of the activities in your professional life might mean. Networking was one example of that. But she helped me really reframe that and kind of set me on a really different trajectory in terms of my career progression and my kind of leadership skills, which was, really impactful for me.
Yeah, we always need that, I think, so we don't get stuck in, not stuck, but we always need a refresh, I think, with our jobs, particularly if you've been there for a while.
Totally.
So thank you for sharing that.
Pleasure.
So we're going to move on to our topic today, which is we're talking about food waste and how we can reduce our food waste. But before we do that, I like to start with a few definitions. So the first thing I'd like to know is, how do you define household management?
How do I define household management? I think specifically when it relates to food, it's a whole suite of behaviors. And it really is, very dependent on the kind of household that you live in, but there's also a lot of common factors. So how and when are you shopping? Where are you shopping? Who are you shopping for? What are the different requirements within your family? Do you have dietary requirements? Do you have neurodiversity requirements? What's your budget? What kind of ethical or health decisions are you making in terms of what you're feeding the family? How skilled are you in terms of cooking and food management and prep and all of that kind of stuff? So I think, it's this big bucket of lots and lots of different behaviors, but also lots and lots of decisions that get made like all day, every day, about how food gets managed within the household that are influenced by all of these external factors, plus things, like advertising or special offers or, a recipe that you saw on Instagram, like all of these other things are also influencing that. So it's this huge kind of maelstrom. And I think trying to kind of bring some order to some of that is a really useful way of then being able to identify where those kind of pain points are, both in terms of waste, but in other areas as well, like your budgeting or your meal planning or whatever. Bringing some order to that can really help lessen some of that mental load that applies mostly to women, it has to be said, in terms of that kind of household management when it relates to food.
Yeah. I really love how you described it as a maelstrom, because I do feel like it can be very chaotic, trying to think about what you want to buy every day. You're buying all these different ingredients and then things get shoved to the back of the fridge and you just end up with, food waste. So that brings me on to my next thing that I'd like to find, which is, what is food waste?
So food waste is anything that goes in the bin, essentially. So anything that you're throwing away, whether or not it could have been eaten, is food waste. And then what we do kind of in this space is we talk about edible versus inedible. So in Australia, about 70% of the food that we throw away from our homes could have been eaten. So, which is pretty bad when you think about it, like, 3/4 of what we're throwing away actually could have been eaten. So that's not like your eggshells, your banana peels. That's like the bread that went moldy, the salad that was limp, the carrot that went kind of sad at the back of the fridge, the cheese that you threw away because it was after the best before date. So there's all of these things, like it might be moldy when you threw it away, but ultimately it was originally edible. So that's essentially how we try and look at it. So what we really want to do is focus on that 70% that basically is essentially you throwing money in the bin, right? So we all spend all this money at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, at wherever, every week, every day, and we're throwing a bunch of that in the trash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a thing that happens in my home. We try to avoid it, but once a week we go, here's the rest of the leftovers, goes in the bin. Here's some cut up fruit that I didn't eat in the bin. And I don't feel great doing that, but at the same time, like,
what are you going to do?
What am I going to do? I can't eat it now. It's too late.
Yeah, and I say, and look, number one, everyone does it, right? So you're not like, oh my God, I'm this one person who's doing this terrible thing. We all do it. Like, I've worked in food waste for coming up to 10 years, and I still find like a moldy snub of bread in the cupboard. Like, it happens. I think the really critical thing, and this applies to so much around sustainability, is it's not about a tiny group of people doing something perfectly. It's about everyone or most people just being a bit better at what we do. So what we really try and do in WRAP and what we're trying to do in End Food Waste is, when we're talking about household food waste, is give people really, really easy, approachable tips and ideas for the little things that you can do at home that are going to help you waste less food, because none of us like wasting food. Like, no one throws food in the bin and goes, yeah, who cares? People don't. Like, we have this emotional attachment to food. It's a really kind of emotive topic for people. And no one sets out to waste food, but there's all of these behaviors that are happening within the household that result in food being wasted. So it's not like a deliberate thing, but there's all of these behaviors that people are doing, like consciously or unconsciously, that basically then are resulting in that food being thrown away.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you, what are those things that we can start doing? But before that, you mentioned that we do have a target to hit by 2030 of, that we want to reduce food waste. And you also mentioned that, households, we dispose of, did you say 70% of?
So in terms of the whole supply chain, households are responsible for about 30% of the total.
Uh-huh.
And of that, 70% was edible.
Okay.
So it's a huge chunk, right? It's a really big proportion. Australia's slightly unusual for a developed nation in that we have quite a big chunk that's being wasted in primary production, in farming, in agriculture. We have a little slice in the kind of manufacturing space. We have a tiny slice in retail. I'll come back to that in a second. We have a huge chunk in our homes. And then we have quite a big chunk as well in hospitality and food service. So restaurants, hotels, catering, schools, that kind of piece. So the Australian kind of landscape is a bit unusual because you have this quite broad spread across the whole food supply chain. Whereas in other developed countries, it's more skewed towards that kind of consumption end and less in primary production. But partly because Australia grows like lots of stuff, and partly because of some of the challenges of agriculture in Australia, we do have quite a lot of like particularly fresh fruits and vegetables that are never making it off the farm, which is really like criminal when you think about it, when you think about how 1 in 5 people is going hungry in Australia or has skipped at least one meal. And there's all of this beautiful fresh produce that we can't get off the farm to get into like the food donation network, for example. So yeah, there's some kind of really interesting challenges across the whole supply chain.
Okay. So I definitely want to get into that in a bit, but I want to know, like, how much does each individual household or each individual person need to change their habits by to help to reach that goal?
So if everyone, well, basically we want to halve food loss and waste. What we looked at when we did the feasibility study that I mentioned earlier was how much you need to reduce it by across the whole food supply chain. So you could just say, right, well, we'll just halve it everywhere. That will give us half by the end. But actually, it's actually not quite that simple. And what we said was, in our homes, what we need to be seeing is a 30% reduction. So if we're all wasting about a third less than we do now, that would really kind of set us on the trajectory to meeting that target. And that is very, very doable, with a few kind of nudges to some of our behaviors that we have around food.
Mm-hmm. All right. And we're definitely going to talk about what changes we can make. But I think it'd be interesting to maybe to go through what you were saying with industry and then manufacturing, preparation, supermarkets, maybe talk about how food gets wasted there and what we can do about that. So let's start with, production, where the food comes from.
Sure. So like I said, Australia grows absolutely masses and masses of food. So we grow enough food here to feed about 60 million people in a country with a population of about 26 million people. So obviously lots of that gets exported, which is great, like really good exporting incredible Australian produce, but lots of it never makes it off the farm. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, and some of which are related to things like pests and diseases or bad weather that there is lots of work happening in that space, but it's not a space that we kind of play in so much. Where we tend to play is things like, right, well, how much of that crop is not making it off the farm because it doesn't meet a cosmetic specification that's set further up the supply chain? So, for example, by the retailers. So can you influence retailers to change or relax those cosmetic specifications or size specifications, for example, so that you can get more of that product off the farm? Can you also look at different kind of contract mechanisms to allow farmers to get more of that produce off the farm? So I'll give you an example. What a lot of farmers will do is they'll grow for their customers, but they won't actually have a contract from their customer that says, I want you to give me a ton of strawberries every 3 weeks over these 4 summer months. They'll just grow on the hope that that's what they're going to be selling. Now, say it's a really bumper year for strawberries and they're like, we've actually got 1.5 tons. Well, automatically, you're putting more stuff on the market, so the price goes down. And so quite often you will get to a position where the farmer is like, it's actually not worth me harvesting this crop because I'm not going to get enough money for it from my customer to make it worth my while. So how do we look at some of these different contractual terms that are allowing farmers to invest in their farms, to diversify their crops, to look at different varietals that, say, for example, need less water or are more hardy or less prone to damage? How do we look at contract terms where we've got a customer that says, actually, we'll buy everything, we'll buy the whole crop, and we'll figure out where each of those different grades goes. So our premium grade goes into store, our second grade goes into the hospitality sector, and then the tertiary grade goes into like smoothies or sauces or, those kinds of products. So there's lots and lots of kind of tweaks that we can make in that space, that some of them are changing what actually happens on the farm, but lots of them are actually changing what happens somewhere else in that supply chain that then influences what happens on the farm.
Okay, so it's very, I guess, logistical.
There's lots and lots of logistics. Yeah, there really is. Another really good example of that is the kind of the cold chain. So Australia's big and a lot of it is hot. And so getting fresh produce from one place to another, we really rely on that cold chain. And actually, in comparison with lots of other developed countries, we don't have that much capacity in the cold chain. And there's also a bit of a challenge with some of the practices that happen in that cold chain. So we've done a lot of work with the Cold Chain Council to say, right, how do we improve how this area performs in terms of food loss and waste? And actually one kind of major element of it is just shut the doors. So when you arrive at your destination and you're unloading, 5 pallets of fresh lettuces on a 40-degree day, don't leave the doors of your refrigerated transportation open for the hour that it takes you to do that. Like, close the doors. So there's these really, really simple, free things that you can do that require somebody to behave a little bit differently. And it's, but changing people's behavior is really hard. So how do you incentivize that person to do it? How do you encourage that person to do it? How do you penalize them for not doing it? There's all of these kind of behavioral, contextual factors that you have to think about when you're thinking about, oh, well, how hard can it be just to get people to shut the door? Like, they don't do it now. So it actually probably is quite hard, because otherwise, why wouldn't they already be doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're having to unload everything, having to open the door is just another annoyance that you have to do. So, how do you make it worth someone's while to keep opening and closing the door, possibly extending how long they have to be there?
Possibly, yeah. And it's really kind of, that's why you have to look at it very holistically, because you've got this scenario at the moment where you've got food that is grown on a farm and then passes through potentially lots and lots of different hands before it gets to our homes. And what you've then got is this really fragmented kind of chain of custody. So somebody who's one part of that chain is like, well, why should I care about this? All I do is pick it up from here and take it to this other place. It's not my problem. And so figuring out how you create kind of ownership along that chain of custody, or figuring out how you incentivize those behaviors is really critical. So as well as kind of developing the evidence and saying, well, actually, here's the thing that we know we need to be doing, it's that implementation piece. And that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning is we know what we need to do. It's how do you actually get it happening on the ground that is the real important bit.
Sounds very difficult. I know that trying to change people's behaviors is probably the hardest part of this whole problem. So good luck with that.
Thanks. It's very interesting because if you think about how, particularly with household food waste, if you think about how we treated food in our homes post-war, so not that long ago, kind of 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, it was completely different. Nobody wasted anything. It was not a social norm to waste food. In fact, it was like frowned upon to waste food because food was a precious commodity. So you can look at that and go, oh, actually, people's behavior has changed actually quite dramatically, quite quickly in that space of time. So it must be possible to change it back. It's just what levers do we need to pull, and how do we need to frame those messages, and who do those messages need to come from to be influential and impactful in changing people's behavior.
Possibly off topic, but we have seen a rise, I think, globally in food prices and also just household expenses. Has there been like a response, I guess, in food waste, like people, wasting less food, buying less food? Is the way forward to make food cost more? I don't want to.
No, it isn't. It's interesting. So there's two things about that. We already in Australia have a bit of a hunger problem. So there are, many hundreds of thousands of people who go hungry, can't afford to eat, are skipping meals, are not eating so their kids can eat. So making food more expensive, while kind of on the face of it, you're like, oh, well, if people pay more money, then surely they value it more. And actually, that's not really true. There's some, you could play around with it a little bit, but the basic premise is even if food's expensive, you still waste it. Because what I said before kind of links back to what I said before, which is none of us are setting out to waste food. We just have all of these other behaviors and all of these other contextual factors that are going on that result in food waste. So making food more expensive won't change that and runs the risk of more people not being able to access good, fresh, healthy food. And, there's already quite a lot of challenges in Australia and globally around things like food deserts, like when you're living in regional or remote communities, how do you get access to fresh fruit and vegetables at a price that is accessible to you or affordable to you, especially when you're in a cost of living crisis. And that's one thing where reducing your household food waste actually can make a real material difference. So the average household in Australia wastes about $2,500 worth of food every year. So when you're in a cost of living crisis and you're like, oh, we need to be like trading down, maybe you trade down your brands, maybe you trade down, I don't like to say this, trade to a different supermarket, like you were shopping at Coles, maybe now you shop at Aldi. Those are the kinds of behaviors that people are doing to try and address the cost of living. They might also, for example, buy a bit less meat because it's expensive. But ultimately, it being expensive doesn't mean people aren't going to waste it.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's good to hear because I don't want the price of food to go up, to be honest.
No, me neither. It's already really expensive.
Yeah. And so I think that, trying to tackle food waste in different ways is a much better solution. I think, Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the cold chain a bit. What would be the next step?
So the next piece is like your kind of retail and manufacturing, or manufacturing and retail space. And retail's really interesting. So retailers actually don't waste that much food in the grand scheme of things. In the whole proportion, they're a tiny percentage of it. But what they do is have a lot of influence both up and down the supply chain. So like I said, they're setting cosmetic standards for what comes out of the farmer's field. So they're setting prices, for example. They're determining what products are going to be on the shelf for their customers. They're also influencing what happens in people's homes. So the kind of packaging that they're deciding on, the date labeling, the storage advice, all of these things influence what happens in people's homes. So retailers are a really critical element of the picture. You got to work with them together to be able to change what happens up and down the supply chain. What End Food Waste does, actually, so there's an initiative called the Australian Food Pact, which is all about bringing together actors from actually all along the supply chain to say, this is a shared problem. How do we come together to fix that problem? So it's not about all the retailers getting together and like price fixing or anything like that. It's nothing like that. It's very much to do with how do we get more good, fresh, healthy food onto our shelves at an affordable price so that people can buy it and then actually eat it when they get home. Because lots of these problems, like I said, are systemic. So even if you're Woolies, even if you're Coles, you can't fix that problem by yourself. However much market share you have to have the rest of the supply chain to collaborate with you to solve some of those problems. And so what End Food Waste does is they really facilitate that collaboration and provide kind of lots of technical advice and guidance and support to those organizations to say, okay, well, how do we do this? Like, we're all around the table. Now what? Now what do we do? Where's the evidence for what changes we should be making? How do I implement this within my business? How do I identify within my business where food is actually being wasted? So there's loads of kind of support that's available for businesses who do want to participate in that kind of initiative.
Okay, so that's like what you were talking about before with the strawberries and having different contracts so that strawberries don't go to waste. And that's partly due to the buying habits of the supermarket.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you then kind of bring people together to say, right, how are we going to deal with these gluts, for example, when you have really good weather, really good growing weather, or for example, in South Australia at the beginning of the cherry season, we had a ton of rain and it actually damaged a lot of the cherry crop. So how do you deal with that? Do you just not put those cherries into the retail environment? So what is there is very expensive. Like, cherries are already expensive, right? Like, you want to get as much of that product into the market as possible, but then how do you talk to customers about why they might look a bit different? So it's really kind of thinking about that very holistically rather than saying, right, well, you, the grower, they're damaged, so it's your problem. It is their problem, but they can't solve it by themselves. You have to bring everybody together to be able to solve those problems.
Okay. And so the next step is us, the household, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now this is the important part, I think. So what are some ways that we can start to reduce our food waste?
Okay, so there's heaps of stuff. I'm gonna like list off a bunch of things, and if everyone who's listening does one of these things, then great. That's amazing. That's an incredible first step. So a few things you can do. So one is set your fridge at the right temperature. So your fridge should be 5 degrees or less. And just doing that will make your food last so much longer. So if you don't know like what that should be, if you don't have like an external temperature display or it's just a dial and you're not really sure, like go online, look up your fridge make and model, and be like, if I want to set my fridge at 5 degrees, what should this dial look like? Is it 1? Is it 7? Like, it's really confusing. We get it. But setting your fridge at 5 degrees or less is one thing. Another thing that can make life simpler to waste less food is meal planning, which is, it can be a bit of effort up front, but it saves you heaps of time and effort during the week when you're then cooking those meals. And it also saves you from buying stuff that you don't need. So if you're shopping to a list that you've made off the back of your meal plan, you're less likely to buy stuff that you don't need. And you're also more likely to go and check your fridge and your pantry before you go shopping. So that's the third thing I would suggest is before you go shopping, open your fridge, snap a quick pic on your phone. Same with the pantry, like snap a quick pic of the shelves. And then when you're at the shop and you're like, damn, do I have any tin tomatoes? You can just have a quick peek at your photo and be like, oh yeah, I've got 3 tins, so I definitely don't need to buy any more. So yeah, really kind of easy. Like all of these things are like free to do. So you can go online and like download a meal planner. I literally scribble it on the back of a piece of paper. Like I have one sheet of paper that does like 4 weeks worth of meal plans. It's not pretty. I think, so there's another thing that people can do is store your fresh fruits and vegetables in the fridge. Mm-hmm. So it's really tempting to be like, I bought these like beautiful apples. I'm going to leave them on the counter. Those apples will last 8 times longer if you keep them in the fridge. And you just pop it out for like half an hour before you want to eat it, or if you pop it in your lunchbox when you're taking it to work or your kids' lunchboxes, it'll be fine. It's kind of up to room temperature if, like me, you don't like biting into like a really cold apple. But just kind of storing those, particularly fruits, in the fridge will help them last so much longer and get so much more opportunity to be eaten rather than kind of throwing them away.
I'm always very surprised by, like, we'll go to the supermarket. Oh, we need some more apples. And we'll come home and there's apples that are in the fridge already. We've forgotten about them, but they're fine. And I don't know how long they've been there.
Yeah, well, so Rap did a bunch of work looking at two different things. So one is like, how long does stuff last? And pretty much every product that we tested, if you put it in the fridge and your fridge is set at the right temperature, it lasts anywhere from like 4 to 8 times as long, which is just amazing. And then the kind of the flip side of that research was, if you put a date on something, how does that influence what people will do? So particular best before date. So gave people pictures of like bananas. So say like 1 is your green banana, 10 is your like black banana. And we said to people like, oh, how far up the scale would you eat the banana? And with no date, people would go, I think they were like 6.7 was the average. If you put a date on it, a best before date at 5, people stop at 5. So just taking the date off, so not doing something, gives you another like 1.7's worth of opportunity to eat that banana, just by taking off the date label. So that's an example of where, as a householder, that's not necessarily something that you're going to do. Like you're not going to take the date labels off, but your retailer should be helping you by really consistently labeling the product. So if there's no food safety issue, you don't need a use by date. If there's no quality issue, you don't need a best before date. So take those labels off. Sell your fresh fruit and uncut vegetables loose so people can buy only what they need instead of buying a whole bag of carrots. You're like, I only need 3 carrots for that one recipe. I'll just buy 3. Get friendly with your freezer. Like you can freeze so much stuff. Like you can freeze cheese, you can freeze milk, you can freeze leftover wine. You can use that in like stock or risotto. You can freeze so much stuff like tortillas, like we just keep tortillas in the freezer because as soon as you kind of pull one out and leave it on the counter for 2 minutes, it's kind of defrosted. But then there's not like a pack of 10 that's, got 3 left in it. They're going moldy in the cupboard. The freezer is your friend. Get a Sharpie, just write on it what it is, which I never do. And then I have all this like weird unidentified stuff living in my freezer. I'm like, is this stock or is it egg whites? Who knows? God, there's like so much. There's a bunch of things. I'll probably stop there because, I can go on for ages about what people can do at home. But essentially, buy what you need and eat what you buy.
Yeah. I have problems with both of those things. We always have grand plans of eating many vegetables, and then at the end of the week, oh, we didn't eat this broccoli. Oh, this kale looks a bit old. So yeah, we'll be making a meal plan, I think.
Yeah, great. And then I just think, especially in winter, like soup is your friend. You can put literally anything in soup, like soggy lettuce. Just put it in your soup, like blend it up.
Lettuce
it's
in
great.
soup?
Yeah, absolutely. Like any sad greens, put them in your soup and blend it up. And tastes great. The other great thing is buy frozen vegetables. Like they're picked really fresh. They're full of nutrients. They're flash frozen. So they're really fresh and healthy. And you keep them in the freezer and you only use what you need. And it's kind of this weird thing. Like everyone has frozen peas, right, in the freezer. And it's totally normal to buy frozen peas. And then you say, well, why don't you buy like frozen chopped onions or frozen kale or frozen broccoli? People are like, oh no, that's weird. It's like, it's the same. And you use only what you need. So if you want to do like a stir fry, you probably would buy like fresh snap peas or fresh broccoli. But to have your basics in the freezer, or even if you're like, oh, that broccoli looks a bit sad, I'll just chop it up, pop it in a little Ziploc bag and pop it in the freezer. You've immediately got, a couple of months more life of that broccoli. So the next time you're like, pulling stuff out of the fridge and the freezer, like, what can I make? It's soup, it's a stir fry, it's like broccoli pasta, like whatever. You've got that there and you've just given it that bit of extra life.
My favorite is frozen onions. Like, sometimes it says half an onion. Well, what do you do with the other half?
Exactly.
Usually it goes in the fridge and it dies in the fridge. Sometimes if I remember to do it.
Plastic bag, and then you're like, oh, I'll put that in the fridge. And then 2 weeks later, it's like shoved to the back. And you're like, what even is that? Oh, it's a salad onion.
But I also hate chopping onions. So it means that I can just, like, if I'm like making a really quick dinner, I can just shove it in the pot.
Exactly.
Without doing any cleanup.
It's genius.
Yeah. And I love buying the frozen onion in the supermarket as well.
Yeah, just any of those kind of frozen veggies are amazing. They're so convenient. They're like real time savers. So we're all super busy. Why we don't need to be chopping an onion from scratch. Like there's no food police standing over you being like, oh, well, that's not artisanal enough. You used a frozen onion. Like nobody cares.
Sometimes I care.
Release yourself from the pressure.
It's not chopped fine enough. Anyway, sometimes I can let it go. And then you know what? We're not wasting food.
Good. Exactly.
So we're going to move on to the practices and habits section. So this is a chance for you to talk about, a practice that you use in your home to manage your food that you've maybe learned from your work.
So many. I think, before I kind of dive into that, it's important to say I still do like waste food. Like I am not perfect. That's not the goal of what we're trying to do. It's not for everybody to be perfect because life happens. Like you come home and you're like, oh, that's on the meal plan, but I had a late meeting and now literally all I want to do is have a glass of wine and sit on the couch. These things happen. It's about trying to be just like that little bit better and be like, oh, well, I've noticed, for example, in our house, like we were wasting a lot of bread. And I was like, right, this is like such a waste of money. Like we buy these like fancy artisanal sourdough loaves of bread that are like $12. It's ridiculous. And you'd get like a third of it left and it would kind of be going stale. And I was like, right, I need to figure out a way of fixing this. And so what I just started doing at the outset was literally, I just put them all in like a Ziploc bag and I put them in the freezer. And I was like, right, that's the first part of the problem is solved. Like, they're in the freezer. So I've delayed the inevitable. And then basically what I did was I just pulled out my NutriBullet and I blended them into breadcrumbs. And then I just put them back in that Ziploc bag in the freezer. So anytime I want to make like a pasta dish or like a schnitty or anything that needs breadcrumbs, like I have a supply of them in the freezer. And then when that next like 1/3 of the loaf of bread is going a bit stale, then I can blend them up and I can add them to the to that Ziploc bag. So it's just kind of noticing in your home what the habits are that are causing these, maybe like this one item or that one item to go to waste, maybe more than other things. And being like, right, well, what can I do to address that? And like, there is literally no food that you can't go on the internet and be like, I've got leftover blah, what should I do with it? Like, there is a recipe for everything. And, you know, there's so much inspiration. It can be a bit overwhelming, but if you're looking for something like, oh, this always goes to waste, how do I fix that? Sorry, go on.
And possible, I don't know if this is a tip or just something that my partner does. He likes to use AI to come up with recipes for things we have in the fridge.
Yeah.
He's like, we have some feta and some tomatoes. What meal can I make with this?
What should I do? Well, you should make that viral pasta dish went around everywhere, obviously.
But like, he likes asking AI what he should do, and then it gives him some recipes. Sometimes they're not good, but
well, it's just like I said, like you can put literally any ingredients into Google or your preferred search engine, and it will give you like a recipe. And even if you're like, oh well, that doesn't sound like exactly what I wanted, but I can adapt that, or I can switch out that product for this product or that ingredient for this ingredient. And it's just giving you this sense of like, you know, a bit of inspiration, but also like, oh, I've got leftover blah, or I've got sad looking blah. And there will always be a piece of advice that tells you like what to do with that, like putting your sad lettuce in your soup. Like, I think the other thing for me that's really made a difference in my house is meal planning. And I do it at the weekends. And generally I will pull out like a couple of my recipe books. I've got like 8 million recipe books that I never looked in. And I was just like, these are purely decorative. And I decided, right, this is like, I can't buy any more recipe books unless I'm actually cooking from them. So I'll pull out a couple of recipe books. I'll go through them for inspiration and do a meal plan for the week, and usually for like 4 or 5 days. So I'm basically like, I know that there'll be at least one day, probably 2, where I'll end up going out, or something will happen. I'll be late home from work, or just something will happen where what we planned doesn't play out the way that we thought it would. And so the meal plan will be like, okay, well, kind of the idea is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, this is what we'll have. But if we end up having Tuesdays on Thursday, then that's fine. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is we kind of shopped for those meals. And I have store cupboards like basics, like, you know, pasta and tin tomatoes and garlic and the spices like that last a long time. But then the meal plan is kind of done. And the thing that I find is that, and this obviously is not applicable to everybody, but I love to cook, but I hate thinking of something to cook. So when I come home at night after work and I'm pooped, I'm just like, if I know what's on the meal plan, I'm like, oh, great. Actually, that cooking that is quite therapeutic to me. It's like, it's a nice relaxation. I can have a glass of wine. I listen to a podcast while I'm cooking. And it's a nice transition from work to home. But if I come home and I have to stand in front of the fridge, like mindlessly staring into the fridge, waiting for like the inspiration to strike me of what to make, that's the thing that I can't do. And I can't get my brain around, you know, my tired brain at the end of the day around what should I make? So that kind of 20 minutes at the weekend saves so much time and effort during the week that it's worth its absolute weight in gold.
Okay. I'll give it a go this weekend. and our listeners should too. Yes.
Well, even if you're just saying like, oh, one night we'll have pasta, one night we'll have fish, one night we'll have chicken, one night we'll have like a veggie thing, and on Friday we'll order in. Like, even if all you're doing is giving yourself like that little bit of brain space to be like, okay, well, there's one less thing I have to think about on the day. It's I don't know if you've heard of like decision fatigue. It's like a real thing. Like, you can only make so many decisions in the day. It's why like Einstein used to wear the same clothes every single day, because he was like, I've got other more important decisions that I have to make. And it's that thing of when you come home at the end of the day, you've run out of decision capability, which is why you end up standing in front of the fridge being like, ugh, there's no food, when you've got a whole fridge full of food.
Yeah. And so weekend decision-free, you can make those decisions.
Exactly.
For weekday decisionless you.
Exactly. So it's kind of like Sunday Claire is really doing Thursday Claire a massive favor.
Yes. Unfortunately, past Gabriella isn't the kindest to present Gabriella. Past Gabriella has to be better to future Gabriella.
Yeah, you need to cut yourself some slack.
So we've got some questions from the audience today. And if you, our listeners, do want to, ask your questions to our future experts, you can go onto our Instagram page at the beginning of the week and click on our stories. And then you'll see who we're talking to that week, what topics, and you can send in your questions. So we've got 2 questions today. So our first one is, how do individual and household behaviors contribute to the complex landscape of food waste? And what are some effective strategies to raise awareness and change consumer habits toward reducing waste in the kitchen? Long question.
That is a long question. So I think what's really important to kind of stress is that people don't set out to waste food. So no one is like buying their groceries and bringing them home being like, yeah, I'll probably throw some of that away. Like, that's not how people think about food. And what's happening is that, as I said, there's all of these behaviors that contribute to food waste. And it's not like, it's not really like a kind of mental process. It's more like an invisibility cloak that kind of goes around that food. So what's really interesting is when someone's thrown food in the bin, they don't see it as food anymore. They see it as rubbish. So there's this kind of weird switch that gets flipped when you've thrown something away. That's like, oh, well, that's just rubbish. So I don't need to kind of feel bad about it. Whereas if you actually ask people explicitly, like, oh, how do you feel about wasting food? Like, should we make efforts to waste less food? Blah, blah, blah. Everyone's like super supportive of that. And it makes kind of food loss and waste a really kind of bipartisan topic. Like, you can talk to people from all across the political spectrum, from all across the economic spectrum about valuing food. And people tend to be, broadly in agreement with the concept. So it's really about how do we kind of shift some of those behaviors. And sometimes that is about making an explicit ask of people. So doing a meal plan is an explicit ask. It's saying, introduce this new behavior into your routine to save you time and effort and to save you from wasting food and to save you the money that you were throwing away. Whereas there are other ways of influencing people's behavior that do change their behavior at home, but is the root cause of that is somewhere else. So the example I always like to use is it's much easier to give people cheese in a resealable pack than it is to ask people to wrap their cheese in cling wrap once they've opened it. So if you buy cheese and it's in a resealable pack, you're going to just seal it up when you're finished using it. Of course you are. It's a habitual movement that you're very used to doing with lots of other different kinds of products, even non-food products. So that change that can be made in the supply chain then influences how you're behaving at home and helps you waste less food. You're not cutting off like the dry end because you forgot to wrap it up, or it kind of came loose, or your kid didn't re-wrap it up after they took a hunk of cheese out of the fridge, whatever. And that's why it's really important to look at this very holistically and to say it's very important to talk to people directly about food waste, to raise that awareness and help people have those like really kind of good hints and tips that they can take home. But it's also really important to influence the kind of the products and the retail environment that they're in such a way that kind of changes their behavior at home. And it's also really important because people want their retailer to be helping them. So a lot of the research that WRAP does with consumers is shows that people want their retailers to be doing something themselves. So they want to be seeing that they're donating food, that they're reducing their own food waste, but they also want them to be saying, oh, here's how we're going to help you, our customers, waste less food at home. And it's changes, like I said, changes to the products, changes to the packaging. If you go into a supermarket in the UK now, you will very, very ever rarely see a buy one, get one free offer. They'll do half price instead. So same financial saving, but you're not encouraging people to buy more than they need. So if you want double of that product, whatever it is, strawberries, and you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to throw them in the freezer, I'm going to make jam, I'm going to make a bunch of smoothies, great. But if you don't have a use for that extra punnet of strawberries, you still get the financial saving, but you're not buying too much.
I actually love that as a change because, yeah, I think so many people have been tricked. No, not tricked, but encouraged to buy more than they need that they won't eat because, you know, it's you have to buy two to get the savings.
Exactly. And it's kind of like, well, if you buy one, you're still paying the same amount of money, but then you're like, oh, but I'm not getting that other punnet of strawberries, even though deep down I know I'm not going to use them. So the half price versus buy one, get one free is a really important kind of psychological kind of nudge to help people make those changes. Same with things like printing storage advice on your fruit and veg bags. So saying, keep me in the fridge for your apples, and you've got that, and like when you unload your shopping and you've got the bag in your hand and it says keep me in the fridge, you're more likely to put it in the fridge. So there's all these little kind of nudges that help people to just slightly shift what they're doing at home that helps to waste less food.
Great. Good. Easy. Just, read the instructions on the packet.
Which, of course, everybody does.
Yes, of course.
I'm like that meme, and it's like the guy looking in the bin and it's like, oh, me reading the instructions on the packet that I just threw away.
Yeah. Oh, I do that all the time. I'll put something in the microwave and I'll, throw the packaging away. 5 minutes later, how long did it say to put it in the microwave for?
Should I PS this?
Yeah. And that's very much, and then I'll throw it in the bin again and then it'll be 5 minutes later. Oh, wait, how long was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I pointed my eyes at that writing, but I did not absorb any of the information.
No.
Yeah.
It's one point at a time.
Exactly.
So for our second question, it's also another long question. Are there any emerging technologies or innovative approaches that show promise in tackling household food waste? And how can communities, businesses, and policymakers work together to implement these solutions and create a more sustainable food waste landscape?
These are very comprehensive, these questions. You've obviously got very well-educated listeners. Mm-hmm. innovation and technology, it's interesting. So yes, there are kind of all sorts of things coming out in this space. The other day, what was I reading about the other day? It was like some school kids that during COVID had developed like it was a little piece of technology. I can't remember if it was an app or like a website where it was basically like, oh, you plug in. So like the AI kind of thing, like you plug in what you've got and it will give you like really fun recipes to make with what you've got. So I think there's lots of kind of tools that are already out there or that are emerging that we can use. There's a bunch of apps that you can use. Like I literally follow a bunch of people on Instagram who are like food waste chefs, and they'll be like, oh, I made these muffins out of banana peels. It's like, that's cool. I'm probably never going to do that. But the next thing that they post is like, oh, here's like how you use up that sad lettuce in the soup. And you're like, oh, I actually am going to do that. So I think there's tools and technology that's out there, and I'm sure more like innovative stuff will come as time goes on. I think what's really critical for me in this space is that we're really thinking about it holistically. Like I said at the very beginning, like we know how to solve this problem. Like it's not like we're floundering and being like, this is insurmountable, or there's this big kind of gap in our knowledge about how to fix this. But it can't be one bit of the supply chain or one segment of the population by themselves. Everybody has to step up to the plate. So as householders, it's for us, like it's really having that awareness about what's happening in your home and being like, okay, well, here's like 2 things that I can do to try and reduce that. And like I said at the beginning, it's not about being perfect. Like no one is perfect. You just have to do your best. But it's also that other kind of systemic approach to it where policymakers are saying, well, actually, what we really want to see is that all of the major retailers and the brands and manufacturers are joining the Australian Food Pact, because that's a really good initiative to help them waste less food in the supply chain and to help consumers waste less food at home. It's about looking at what research is done globally around the best mechanisms for changing people's behavior. Like that's an emerging discipline. Like there's lots of research and ever new evidence that comes out about how do we change people's behaviors? What are the most effective ways of doing it? It's about thinking about how do we change those social norms so that throwing food away is just not a thing that it's socially acceptable to do. And people are kind of weird and inconsistent, but they're consistently inconsistent. And they're really we're really social animals. Like we want to be part of a tribe. And if we think, oh, this is what everyone's doing, like everyone else is doing this, like we'll do it too. And so if it starts to become that social norm where it's like, everyone like is really careful about not wasting any food, then we start to do it too. So the more we can use this kind of systemic approach to kind of create those norms, the more it becomes a thing that just everybody does. And you don't then have to invest like millions of dollars in advertising campaigns, for example. Like right now, we're not at a point where that's the case. Like we do have to invest millions of dollars in things like advertising campaigns and getting influencers on board and talking to the supermarkets about how they change what they do and talking to the farmers about how they change what they do and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, probably, sorry, I just waffled on really.
That's okay.
About with that very long question.
That's okay. It sounds to me like we should use peer pressure for good.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not even really peer pressure because it's not necessarily an explicit thing. It's kind of an implicit thing. I'll just give you one quick example. So in, I think it was Sweden, they did a piece of research. It's nothing to do with food waste. It was to do with energy bills. And they slightly changed the energy bills that got sent to one like part of the town where they basically said, your neighbors are saving money on their bills by sending in their meter readings. So it's basically to encourage people to send in the meter readings, not just have estimated readings. So just by saying that, they got a massive increase in the number of people who were sending in their meter readings because they were like, oh, my neighbors are doing this. Oh, I'll do it too. So that's not like expensive to do. It's literally just thinking about the very specific wording that you use and how you can think about, right, how do people behave? And what's all the weird stuff that we do? And how do we make it feel like you're doing something that's part of the norm and you get a benefit from it? So yeah, that's kind of really the space that's really interesting and that, definitely needs more research and more investment in, but it's going to pay like huge dividends.
I think so. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can do because, it's such an interesting space. It's a bit of psychology, it's a bit of food waste, it's a bit of, I guess, marketing, advertising. It's all sort of mixed in there together.
Oh, yeah. There's so much to go at. And it really means that you get to work, or I get to work with these like incredible multidisciplinary teams and like these people who come from like this behavior change background. And then you've got these like product technologists who are like, oh, well, what we could do is like, you can make the packaging like this and then we can put the date label here. And it's just like, it's incredible. And the thing about this kind of subject is everyone's like, oh yeah, well, we definitely should not be wasting all of this food. So once you've kind of turned people onto it and pointed out kind of a bunch of food waste happening over there, like we should do something about that. They're like, oh my God, we should do something about that. And you get all these like smart, enthusiastic people who are bringing all of their like capability to bear on this problem. It's why we have all these incredible solutions. And really now it's just like, how do we get this huge drive behind it and also cash? Like, how do we get more money into organizations like End Food Waste and organizations like WRAP who are like, we know how to do this. We just have to figure out how to do it at scale or just have the money to do it at scale, and really be driving this change at the pace that we need it to be. Like it can be done, but we're not going fast enough.
And if people want to find out more about WRAP and End Food Waste, and if they want to maybe donate or if they want to, just find some new initiatives that they can do at home, where can they find you?
So you can go to rapasiapacific.org. That's my website. That also links through to the main WRAP website where we have literally so much stuff. Like if you want to read about the work that we do on food waste or clothing or plastics, like there's so much stuff on there. It's like a gigantic rabbit hole. You can also go to End Food Waste odds, I think, or endfoodwaste.com.au. endfoodwaste.com.au, where you can find out more about what End Food Waste does. If you're a business and you want to join the Australian Food Pact, there's details on there. I would highly recommend you check out all of the incredible resources that are available there.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll make sure that all of those links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.